we're going to discuss some of the theory as we build this demo. So I've got a PowerPoint that might help a bit. So just coming along here, looking at data access now using ASP.NET. And what we want to be able to do is add a database connection to the project, right? So that's something else that will go in our configuration file. We're going to look at using SQL DataSource Controls so that we can have access to all the CRUD operations, reading data, creating, updating, deleting, and so on, right? And we'll look at a details view as well as a grid view, and we're going to look at some event handlers as well to go along with that. Okay. So just to talk a bit about two-tier versus n-tier. So client-server is really referring more or less to a two-tier arrangement, right? Where we have the database and then a web application talking to that, and then we have our client browser. We can break it out into further multiple layers, and that's often done in more of an enterprise level development environment. But for now, client-server is what we're focusing on. So when we look at the toolbox, right, inside of our web form application, there's all the standard ones, buttons and drop-down lists and so on. But we have a whole section for data controls. Let's just talk about the difference between data source and data bound controls. So data source controls are the ones that return data, right? So notice that we have a few here where there's an access, an entity data source, a link, an object, and then the main one we're going to be using is the SQL data source, right? So there's different ways to get data, different controls we can use on our web form, depending on what the data repository actually is. Then there are the data bound controls. These are the ones that actually appear visibly. The data source controls, although we stick them on the form in design view, they don't actually ever have a presence on the screen at the client end. Data bound controls are the ones that are used to display and manipulate data actually on the client, right? So, of course, to a certain degree, text boxes and so on can be data bound. But what we're really talking about here are things like the form view, details view, grid view. Those are the most common ones, right? There are others as well, list views and so on and so forth. Okay, but grid view and details view are what we're going to spend our time working with. All right. So where's the database? Obviously, we can connect to it on a local area network. We can go through TCP, right? So you can actually have the database on one server on the internet and have your web application running somewhere else altogether, and it can connect through TCP, and away you go, right? But what we're going to do for now is take advantage of our app data folder and store the database right inside that folder. This is not something we would do in a sort of a real professional environment or production environment, but it's great. It's great convenience for us during development. We just have a relative path then to the database file. So we can just pick up the whole project folder and move it from one computer to another, even to a different location on the same computer. And by using a relative path as well, it just means it'll find the data, whoop, there it is, and everything will keep on working, right? Okay. All right. So we've created our empty website. Okay, we'll add a web form in a moment, and we have our SQL Server database in the app data folder. Okay. All right. So maybe we can just stop there. That kind of works through a different scenario, which I'm not prepared to do. I'm going to do our actual art house, but I think that just gives a bit of a background here. So what I need then is I'm going to right click and add a web form. Now I could go new item and find it, but right down here are some common ones that it anticipates we might want. I should explain an HTML page will have a HTML extension that works fine. You can use HTML pages in a ASP.NET application, but the web form, the ASPX file, that's what we're really going to focus on. I'm going to call it default. And away we go. So we've already talked about this a little bit. We know a bit about how it works and so on. There's the code behind page and that kind of thing. So let me go to the design view and let me bring up the toolbox. Actually, maybe I'm going to quickly show you something. I probably shouldn't, but I'm going to show you this anyway. If I drag and drop this table and drop it on the page, look at all the magic that happens here. It created a SQL data source control and created a grid view, right? And here I can just check off enable paging and sorting and editing and deleting, right? And let me run this now. It'll bring it up in a browser. And there's our data from our database. I can even click these headings, sort it by each one way or the other. Here's edit and delete. And now I wonder if it'll even work. Let's try editing. Just put some extra letters in here. Update. Look at that. It's even editing. I could delete and so on, right? Okay. So that was easy. Our job is done. Ugly as anything, but hey, you can see the functionality already there, right? Okay. Now, just kind of quickly look at the source then. Let me focus first of all on the data source control, right? So what we see in the HTML of the page, here is our SQL data source control, right? Run at equals server, of course, there's a connection string here, okay, which we'll look at in a minute because I'm going to take it out actually. So, and here is all the SQL. Look at that. It wrote all this SQL. Delete, okay, insert, right? There's a whole bunch of them in here. There's the update and so on and so forth. I'm not going to take time to look at them all. But all of our, there's our select commands. So all the SQL commands are generated automatically by the system. Notice that they're even parameterized queries. And so all the parameters are defined here. So for delete, we just need the one parameter, the ID. For insert, these are all the parameters that we need to supply the data for inserting. Remember, this was directly the table, which is why we see all of these updated bys and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so that's the data source. And then here's our grid view, right? That was the grid showing all the data. And I'm just going to draw your attention to the fact that we have a command field. Well, that was where those buttons for edit and so on appeared. You may or may not have noticed that as we changed the mode of the grid view, when we switched to edit mode, the buttons displayed in the command field changed. We had basically a save and cancel, right? Or update and cancel, whatever it was. I can't remember right now. But the other part of this is these are all bound fields. So a bound field is kind of smart. The idea is that it knows in sort of read-only mode or display data mode that everything would just be shown with labels, right? Because you can't change it. But when you click that edit button and you switch the one row into edit mode, then the bound fields would all switch to have text boxes instead, which is okay, but not perfect, right? For when you notice I cleverly didn't try to change something like the artist ID because that would not have worked very well, right? Because that's a foreign key, and unless I know the IDs of all the artists, right, I wouldn't be able to get away with it. Okay, so that's just a quick example of the kind of power you have with this tool, but it works much better if we take control of the whole thing to begin with. So let me delete this. And I'm going to delete our grid view. Okay, and I want to come down to the web config, show you here it added this new section for connection strings, right? And actually, there's nothing wrong with it per se. Notice it has the connection string using this attached DB file name. That's why it always works as a relative path, because it says /, that's the vertical pipe character, data directory. So that's referring to the app data folder. So that's why it can always find this database inside there, the MDF file, no matter where we put it. I might keep this here. I could have it recreate it. No, maybe I will. I'll just delete it. We'll get it back in a minute. Okay. All right. So my default page, if I go back to source, should be pretty clean, and back to the original again. We took everything off. So let's do it the more proper, the right way, and we'll do it a step at a time. So if I come down to the data section, we need some SQL data sources, right? Planning ahead, I'm actually going to need 3 because each one has its own set of commands. Select, insert, update, and delete, right? But our 2 foreign keys, remember we created those list style stored procedures to provide data for drop-down lists of art type and artist. Well, each of those is a separate select command calling our select style stored procedure. So each of those has to have its own data source. So I'm going to put on 3 data source controls in total, right? Obviously, it helps a lot to give them proper names so you can tell which one is which. So please don't hand in the work saying SQL data source 123, right? Give it proper names. Now, there's not a right or wrong for a naming convention here. From old habits, I just tend to put DS for data source. I got into that habit because sometimes I'll even develop with an SQL data source and switch to an object data source at some point in time, and without having to change all the references to it in code for the different types, I might just leave the same name. So DS is more generic for data source. So this could be artist list. It's a good name for the first one, and I'll come to the second one. It really helps to name these. Later on, you'll see you have to choose them out of drop-down lists and so on. Our type list. And last but not least, this one can be for artwork. Okay. All right. So now to configure these, we could do them in any order, it doesn't matter, but here is, you've seen already in the other videos that a lot of these controls on the design surface in web forms have this little arrow in the upper right corner, this what we sometimes call a quick task list, right? There's only one here, configure data source. So the first time through, if I had a connection string, it would show up here, right? Sorry, it got confused there for a second because I deleted the connection string, but I just double-clicked the database again, and now you see the actual MDF file shows up here in the drop-down list. And if I check this off, I can examine the connection string, and you see it's exactly the same as it was when we just dragged and dropped the table on. Okay, local DB, that's the local version of SQL Server that we're running here, right? And then the attached DB file name points to our app data folder, etc. Okay, the next thing it says, do you want to save it in the application configuration file? That's our web config. Yes, so I could call it maybe artwork or arthouse connection string. Okay, now, yes, this tool is actually quite capable of generating the SQL, right, for all the different commands. And, you know, that somehow it works, but it's really not best practice, right? Because picture many pages in a large application. If you're hard coding the SQL in every data source control and you make a change to the database, well, then you have to go to every page where you've stored that SQL command and modify it, right? And that's not a good thing. Whereas if we use and rely on our stored procedures, not only do we have all the performance advantages of using a stored procedure, but all we do is we say use this procedure, and then if we update it in the database, we're all good, right? It keeps it simple. There's less chance of missing one spot where the code didn't get updated, and we'll have a lot fewer errors in the long run. So we'll use a custom SQL statement or stored procedure. Well, it's actually stored procedures is what we want. Okay, so for the artist list, notice that we have choices here for both select, update, insert, and delete. Well, we can ignore the others. All we're using this data source control is to get the artist list. Okay, so that's a stored procedure. And look at that, it happens to be the first one in the list here, in the drop-down list, artist list. So that's it. I don't do anything for update, insert, or delete. Don't have that functionality required of this data source. It's just to return my list of artist names. I can even test the query. I only have 3 in my sample data, and that's just fine. Okay, so it's working. I can just click finish. All right, now let's just have a quick look at the source then here for that. Okay, much less. For this is the one data source, DS artist list, run at server. The connection string pulls it out of our configuration file. And the select command is just the name of the stored procedure. Command type is stored procedure, right? Okay, so that makes it much easier. There were no parameters or anything as well, so it makes it nice and simple. We can do the same thing now the next time through. I can just choose the connection string, right? That's the idea, is you define the connection string where this database is and how we talk to it in one location in a configuration file. And that way, if that ever has to be updated, we don't have to find multiple places to fix it. Again, we use our stored procedures. And this is just our art type list. So no insert, update, or delete to worry about. And there we go. So there's our alphabetical listing of art types. Good. Okay. By the way, I should mention my preference to use display text as the alias for these list style stored procedures. It's really not critical. I mean, you could use the actual more descriptive name, artist or art type, if you wanted to. Again, I just kind of like to keep things consistent in code. You know, if you ever swap it out and you're using a different one, you don't have to change the name of the field, right? Doesn't happen that often, but it could. Okay, so here's the main one then. Here's the one where we're actually going to do all of our CRUD operations on the actual artwork itself. So when I configure this one, again, we just use our connection string. We'll use our stored procedures for everything here. So for the select statement, right, I'm going to start off with select all. Later on, we might look at other options, but basically we want all the data when we do a select. For update, okay, again, we have a stored procedure. So I'll just come down here to artwork update. For insert, what a surprise, artwork insert, and delete, artwork delete. Okay. I can test the query, right? And there's my data being returned from my select all. So notice, of course, this is actually coming from our view, right? Which is why we have not only these foreign key, the integer values that are in the actual artwork table, but the lookup values coming from the related tables, right? This last name, comma, first name arrangement for artists, and just the names of the different art types. Okay. All right. So I will just click finish. And there we go. Let's have a look at that one in code. This will be the most complex one, right? So our DES, our data source for the artwork itself, you see all the parameters, right? So delete parameters, there's just one. Insert parameters, okay? Notice that there's an input output for ID. Now, truth is, we aren't actually making use of that newly generated primary key, but it is set up so we can access that in code and find out what it was if we ever wanted to, right? Because remember, our stored procedure, an insert procedure, our standard way of writing it is to return the newly generated primary key. Our update parameters, okay, everything goes in, gets updated as long as it matches on the primary key value, right? And it's kind of unfortunate that you have to scroll along, but you see all the commands. Here's the delete command, type is stored procedure, and so on. So that's the same for all of them. The insert command, stored procedure, the select command, artwork select all, stored procedure, and so on and so forth. All right. So again, if they ever have to be updated, just changing the stored procedure, none of this code has to be touched. Okay, so that's all my data sources that I might need. All right. So going back to the design view, I could show you the grid like we did earlier, but let's look at another one of the tools, right? Here's the details view. I'm looking for it, details view. Main difference between the details view and the the grid view. And the grid view is great. We saw a table, we could edit, we could delete. The one thing you might have noticed was missing is there's no built-in add or insert functionality supported by the grid view. Whereas the details view, and incidentally I'll mention right now the form view as well, both have that capability built in, right? So you can do everything, insert, update, and delete. The limitation of the details view and form view is you're only ever looking at one record at a time. Whereas the grid view, you have that whole table with row after row of different records, right? So often we'll use them in combination, but I'm going to start off just with the details view here, and we can see how it works. So just double clicking puts it on the screen. I can choose the data source, and once I do that, which would be our artwork, notice it went and actually got information from the schema and put it in place, right? So I'm just going to make it a little wider here. All right, so that seems to be almost ready to go, but it's not, okay? We really need to do some work here for a number of reasons. So usually the next thing we do, by the way, if you really want to, Of course, in a more full-blown application, we would have libraries such as CSS frameworks like Bootstrap and so on, which would do a much nicer job of styling even something like a grid view here or a details view. But in the meantime, the tool has this built-in CSS that's available. Now, it's just hard coding CSS into the page, right? It's not particularly advanced, but you can use whatever you want, and I'll just give it a bit of a style that way. All right, so that's the auto format option. So we set the data source, and by the way, if you needed to configure it, you can directly do that from here as well. If it's lost track of the schema, you can click that to go, and it just runs the select statement in the data source and reminds itself what fields are available. Okay, here's the one we're going to work with. Edit fields and later on edit templates. Those are the things we're going to do the most. But in the meantime, there's some things I can select already. Enable paging, enable inserting, enable editing, enable deleting, right? So those are all available. By the way, if our data source control, say, didn't have a delete command defined, then this would be grayed out and we could not select enable deleting, right? If it had insert but it didn't have an update, well then enable editing would be unavailable, right? So these are only available if the corresponding capability is there in the data source. Paging is looked after just by itself. It doesn't require anything special in the data source for that. Okay. So yeah, technically I could actually run it now, but it's not going to work very well in terms of actually manipulating the data. But we'll see it. We'll take things a step at a time. Okay. So you see we have the ID at the top, the name, the date, looks kind of ugly. It has that whole time component. There's that full description, the value. That's a little too many decimal places. That's because money and SQL Server uses 4 decimal places by default. Okay, and here are foreign keys. The art type ID is 1, which corresponds to painting in the lookup table. The artist ID is 2, which corresponds to Mary Frances Gallagher, right, as the artist. And I can step, here's a paging control. I can step through the records, see them all, right? I can click new and notice that command line here changed to insert and cancel. I can cancel. I would have problems actually doing anything because remember, it's the actual IDs here. So, if I click new, I actually have to know what artist ID to type in, art type ID, artist ID, and so on. And it'll be confused because it's trying to send parameters for all these other text boxes, right? And we don't really, we don't have that many parameters set up. So you might get one of these error messages about, well, actually, okay, has too many arguments specified. It was trying to pass too much data because it by default tries to pass one for every element or bound field on the screen. So that's just not going to work. Okay, so to make this actually work so we can insert, update, or delete, we have to do some additional work on our own. All right, so the next thing is the edit field. So again, I'll get my quick task up, go to the edit fields, and that'll bring up a dialog box. I'm going to mention right now, once it's already established a connection and it has the schema for the underlying data source, be careful. It'll probably come up with all the fields provided by the select statement already in here as selected fields. That's good, but if you take one out and you want to add it again, be careful. Notice up here it defaults to showing dynamic fields. That's not what we wanted, not at this point in time. So if I scroll up here, right, here are the bound fields. Remember I showed you that that is the data type that our grid view is using, the same with our details view. Bound fields are the basic ones that we want for now. We'll talk about dynamic fields later on in the course, but for now avoid them. Make sure you work only with bound fields. By the way, there's a slight difference in the little icon. So if you see this extra bit here in the icon, you know you've got the wrong type. Okay, but right now I actually have all the fields in here that I need. In fact, I've got too many, right? Let's talk about the ID. Do we really need to see a system-generated ID, an integer identity in this case, that has no information value, that has no actual relation to the actual data? It's just a programmer's key for tracking records? I'd say no, okay? So I'm going to X that out of here. We don't need it. We don't need it in the display. There we go. Now the title, the date finished, and so on. Yeah, we want that. But notice that for each of these, as I click them, there's properties for the bound field. So the header text, that was what was at the top of the column. So just a little thing, but look at that, date finished. Put a space between it, right? It's only the header text, it's not the field name, and that will make it appear more professional, right, on the label here at the side. Okay, description, that's okay, nothing much to do there. The value, all right, now we notice that we had 4 decimal places there. So there's a few different properties here we can play with. For anything that's coming from the database, we have the data field, but we also can apply a format string, a data format string. And as I click here, you notice a bit of help at the bottom. Let me zoom, right? So you notice it says formatting is applied using this standard approach in Visual Studio, right? This is an enumeration of different formats. So we only have the first one, index 0. So D, of course, would be a short date. C would be currency, and so on, right? Okay. So, boy, I really zoomed in there, didn't I? All right, so I'm going to put in my curly brace, 0, colon, and this is the value, right? Now, I could use C, but then when I'm in edit mode, I don't want that $ showing up. So I think I'll go N2. N is just numeric. It'll put the commas at the thousands, which won't hurt anything. And it'll just limit it to 2 decimal places. All right, now along with that data format string, there's an option up here earlier, apply format in edit mode. Remember when we go into edit, and that same mode is used for insert as well, but insert will be blank. But I'm going to set that to true because I can live with that format even when I'm editing the record. That won't interfere, it will be fine. Okay, and there's lots of other things you can play. Null display text, so if you didn't actually have data, you could put something there like no data available, but that's not something we're going to worry about. None of these fields allow null anyway. All right, so that's the value. Date finished. I kind of skipped over the formatting for that one. Remember we had all the minutes and seconds and so on? So the same idea, we'll put in the format string, curly brace, 0, colon, little letter D for short date, curly brace. And again, I want that format applied in edit mode as well, right? Now, it will just use the system's default short date format. So whether it's month, day, month, year, that can be just based on whatever the settings of the system are. Okay, so that's good. We have the title, right down to value. So the things we have left are basically the foreign keys. So I've got 2 for each, right? Because this is what we want to display as art type, but the data we actually need to manipulate, that we actually need to set, are the actual integer foreign key values stored in the artwork table, art type ID and artist ID. So how are we going to get around this? Well, we got too many. We only need 2 columns here for this information. And what we're going to do is we want to, depending on the mode, we want to either show a drop-down list so you can choose the art type and the artist, or display the actual data coming from the select for the full name of the art type and the artist, right? Our drop-down list, we can link or bind the value, the current value of the selected option in the drop-down list, to these integers. And that's what we're going to do. It takes a couple steps to set up, so bear with me as we walk through this. Okay, I think maybe I'll stop and start the recording.